Hello and welcome back to The Rise and Fall of the Chill Out Room, a history of ambient house and ambient techno from 1989 to 1990 something. I seem to change that on every video and thumbnail. Today I'll be covering a bunch more releases from 1992. No compilation has ever indirectly caused so much controversy and argument than Artificial Intelligence. Compiled and released by Warp Records in July 1992 to highlight the growing number of artists working within the sonic limitations of techno, electro and house, but managing to create music that was more suited to detailed home listening rather than moving feet on dance floors and muddy fields, the album was given the name Artificial Intelligence, as a nod to the slightly retro-futuristic science fiction feel of its cover. With the still very new internet being home to many like-minded individuals who wanted to discuss this new exciting strand of music, dubbed electronic listening music by Warp, members of the Hyperial site on Rave Culture set up a discussion mailing list to chat about it. When looking for a name, somebody came up with a whimsical throwaway gag. What if the artificial intelligence of the Warp compilation's title referred to the music itself? What if this music actually had some sort of intelligence of its own? It was very silly, but the name, Intelligent Dance Music, stuck. It was never ever intended to be a comment on the intelligence of the creators or listeners of the music, simply a joke about pieces of music having artificial intelligence. This fact has seemingly been willingly forgotten, and many music journalists who could easily find out these origins with a quick Google search instead choose to focus on the inferred snobbery in the name, something which has led to heated debate and negative criticisms of the music and those involved, liking them to academics considering their music in some way above other dance music. Okay, I'm being harsh here. The very first message on the list was called "Can Dumb People Enjoy IDM Too?" and phrases like intelligent techno had been circulating for some time. But nevertheless, it shows how a simple joke can be misunderstood and get very out of hand. Anyway, IDM. For most people, the name means hyper-fast jungle and breakbeat with snare rushes so fast they inadvertently led to another daft name, drill and bass. Or it means the kind of glitch-heavy abstraction of acts like Autechre and their more accessible melodic cousins, the likes of which once dominated labels like City Centre Offices and N5MD, and still find a home with the likes of Touch Music and similar imprints. It sometimes refers to the mangled acid of artists on Reflex, a style that label tried, and failed, to market as brain dance. But in the early 90s, it was used to describe the early music of Aphex Twin and Autechre, and even groups like FSOL and Orbital. And while it isn't strictly ambient, or even ambient house or ambient techno, there was a huge crossover. The Oscillate Night in Birmingham, run by higher intelligence agency main man Bobby Bird, for example, hosted performances by Biosphere, Higher Intelligence Agency, A Positive Life, Banco de Gaia, but also Autechre, Orbital, Freeform and Music. While this series looks at the eras with hindsight, dissecting the different approaches and how they will go on to inform electronic music into the late 90s and beyond, at the time there wasn't much interest in such pedantry. People were too busy enjoying the music. Either way, between 92 and 95, plenty of IDM would run close enough to ambient to fit in perfectly. Artificial Intelligence has some slightly crude moments. Autechre's two tracks are remarkably primitive, especially given that there's plenty of material in their Warp Tapes mixes that sound more developed than Crystal and The Egg. Both show off their electro and hardcore influences to a degree barely hinted at even on their debut album in Q Nebula. Richard D. James had been making waves as Aphex Twin, AFX, Powerpill, Caustic Window and Universal Indicator, largely with his own brand of manic, distorted, post-acid industrial techno, although occasionally throwing in mellow tracks like On the Romance Tip and Analogue Bubblebath. His contribution here is Polygon Window, released as The Dice Man, although later to be assigned to the Polygon Window alias. It's gentle but sinister and not too different to material he'd release later in the year on his debut album. B12's material, both tracks assigned to their Musicology alias, is the most overtly dance-oriented, with Premonition being a slice of clattering house with vocal samples, and somewhat out of place here. Despite quickly moving away from the sound over coming releases, Speedy J provides the most ambient-leaning tracks on the album, with the gorgeous D-Orbit and the beatless Fill 3. As with B12 and Aphex, Richie Hawtin and the Black Dogs' Ken Dowie both hide their tracks behind obscure aliases, Up and IAO respectively, and both fall closer to the dance floor than the armchair. and another one-off name appears at the end, although for contractual reasons. The Orb name was stuck behind contracts with Big Life, so a live version of A Huge Ever-Growing Pulsating Brain appears as Loving You by Dr. Alex Patterson. The 4-minute excerpt sticks out like a sore thumb at the end of the album with its weather and ethnic vocal samples and dreamy sequences. Unsurprisingly, the other 6 artists on the compilation would all sign to Warp and release albums the following year, while this is the only time the Orb would appear on the label. The first Artificial Intelligence compilation feels like a transitional record, with some tracks still very much rooted in dance music and others taking tentative steps towards the living room. It's rightly held up as a landmark record, its influence stretching far beyond the inspiration behind the naming of the subgenre, and it, along with the 7 records that would follow it in the Artificial Intelligence series, would go on to define the direction of experimental electronic music well beyond the ambient era, with roots of most 21st century electronica arguably being spawned here. It might be eclipsed quality-wise by a number of albums to come, but Artificial Intelligence should never be overlooked. Probably the first album to really eclipse it was by one of its artists, Richard D. James, and his debut album, Aphex Twin's Selected Ambient Works 85 to 92. Unlike most of the music I'm covering in this series, which has, over time, been forgotten or at least underappreciated, the first Selected Ambient Works has been written about time and time again, and has become the acceptable face of electronic music, frequently being one of a tiny number of electronic albums allowed to be present in Rock Mag's greatest album lists, along with its down-tempo IDM partner Music Has the Right to Children by Boards of Canada. Being the most collected album on Discogs for many years, that site of course started out covering only electronic music, and rarely garnering a bad word in all its extensive coverage. What could I possibly add to that? Not much really. The strength of 85 to 92 doesn't lie in its originality, forward-thinking nature, genre mashing, intricate production, or anything else that gets frequently discussed in terms of landmark electronica. It's simply in James's use of sounds and melodies. As any aficionado of early Aphex will tell you, and I'm probably among them, my interest kind of dropping after I care because you do, the material here isn't too far away from his other works at the time, simply without any of the harshness. The tracks are simplistic, straightforward, repetitive, often minimalist, sometimes quite naive, but James's ear for melody is arguably second to none in modern electronic music, and his ear for texture isn't far behind. Take the stunning Fa, track 2, which is little more than 2 repeated melodies and a kick drum for 9 minutes. The gently modulating pad and bass cycle through numerous levels of subtly different softness, never losing a hint of beauty, the reverb coating the pad lead, making it sound as if it's playing on the other side of a cavern or a huge empty airport. The snippets of chatter that appear occasionally, similarly reverbed, add to that image, and one is left with imagining gleaming white empty spaces, distant voices adding comfort that the listener isn't entirely alone. Despite being one of the cleaner sounding tracks on the album, many pieces were mastered from well-played cassettes James had given to friends, the masters long lost before he realised he could be doing this professionally. It still has a certain lo-fi fuzz to it, the probably cheap gear involved giving the music a familiar worn-in feel that makes even the darker tracks sound strangely welcoming. While the second volume of Ambient Works, released in '94, reverted to more traditional definitions of the style, the music on display here is very much in the 90s mould. The likes of Pulse Width, Ptolemy and Delphium are replete with gentle but energetic techno rhythms, while Green Calx is almost overwhelmed by the acid squelch of a 303. Aegispolis pits mellow electro beats against thick bass, while We Are the Music Makers goes even further with dub bass, breakbeats and spoken word samples, bringing it into ambient house territory. And while much of the album is mellow and inviting, it does occasionally veer into creeper areas, such as the hypnotic Schottky Seventh Path, reminiscent of FSOL's darker material, or the frankly harrowing Head Fellim, which with its detuned synths and overdriven drums is a close cousin to the much harsher material like that found on the Classics compilation. Put simply, Selected Ambient Works 85 to 92 is a masterpiece, one of the finest albums of its kind, and it certainly deserves the acclaim it gets. What is a shame is that what I often consider its sister album, Aphex's Analogue Bubblebath Volume 3, is one of the most overlooked in James's catalogue. With the huge popularity of Warp around the turn of the century, IDM for many became defined by the label, and even imprints like Reflex were somewhat ignored. After a couple of short EPs for other labels, James returned to his own label to release this much lengthier Analogue Bubblebath volume. And while it's overtly less ambient in sound than 85 to 92, for me it's just as evocative and atmospheric a work. While the drums are higher in the mix than on selected ambient works, the structures and textures are really quite similar. Opener .215061 is brimming with gorgeous melodies, and its mellow rhythms make it completely at home alongside material on ambient works. .942937 similarly has the same kind of warm, inviting pads as tracks like Thar, even if the insectile rhythm is a touch sharper. .1993841 and .018087R, yes, this is the start of Aphex being tedious with his track titles. Both overcome their harshness with spooky atmospheric synth leads that help me envisage nocturnal atmospheres in a forest. A couple of the dubbier, breaksier tracks would be completely at home on Orb albums, while Cat 00897B1 is a close cousin of Analogue Bubblebath itself, a gorgeous, wistful ambient piece that once again could have come from 85 to 92. The two CD bonus tracks on the reissue, meanwhile, head into darker drone territories that look forward to ambient works too. And while there are a few harder-edged, dancier tracks here, .000890569 is a fucking banger and one of Rich's best rave-leaning tracks, they do little to spoil the atmosphere. The liner notes of the original 12-inch come with a guide of places of interest in Cornwall, where James grew up, and the strange Celtic-like history of the county really inhabits many of the creepier pieces on the record. Originally released as a 7-track EP with a few odds and ends between the tracks, Analogue Bubblebath was reissued as a full 13-track hour-long album in '93, initially packaged in a bubble-wrap sleeve. It's my favourite Aphex record after the two Selected Ambient Works collections, and I'd so love for Warp to reissue this one day so it can find the larger audience that it deserves. Back briefly to Selected Ambient Works and its impact. Renard van der Perpellier had signed Richard D. James to his acclaimed R&S records earlier in the year, initially to release Didgeridoo. Amusingly, James also licensed the track to Rabbit City for Analogue Bubblebath 2, and Renard reportedly tried to buy as many copies as he could to stop people buying that over the R&S version. But for 85-92 it was clear that the dance-oriented label wasn't quite the right home for it, and so it became the debut release on R&S's ambient sub-label Apollo. I've seen it mentioned more than once that Apollo was created specifically with this album in mind. It would go on to release several of the best-loved albums of the era and became one of the key ambient labels of the early 90s. Purportedly, James was at the R&S office signing contracts for the album at the same time Geir Jensen turned up to sign Microgravity over to Apollo, the first case of one of these records being licensed to another label for overseas distribution, something that would go on to define the way many classics came out from these frequently tiny independent labels. Microgravity actually ended up with the earlier catalogue number. Either way, whichever came first, what an incredible start to the label. Apollo also put out 4 12-inches in '92. First up, Evolution by David Morley, which starts with 4 minutes of gorgeous atmospheric synth and violin, before heading into trancier territory with the gorgeous beat-free Birth on the B-side. All lovely melodies and field recordings, albeit sadly spoiled by the presence of a screaming child throughout. Second was Paradise by Atlantis, a duo with only 3 releases to their name, the others rave-oriented under different aliases. The A-side is probably familiar to many for its frequent appearances on FSOL's radio transmissions, although the atmospheric down-tempo number is a minor classic in its own right, subtly building over 10 minutes to a surprising and incredibly pretty guitar outro. The B-side is more tropical and exotic in sound, with plenty of samples and almost as good. The True Techno EP by Detroit pioneer Juan Atkins as Model 500, which is, as the title suggests, a techno record, and strangely out of place on Apollo, although A-side The Passage has mellow moments. Electrotate's I Love You is the final and is a mellow down-tempo number with bleep and house overtones, and is another of those tracks that, although stylistically somewhat separate from the ambient movement, would equally be at home alongside many of the era's tracks. Sadly, many of these tracks remain much more obscure than the albums Apollo put out, although several thankfully appear on the 1993 compilation simply titled Apollo. Cabaret Voltaire's first full-length release on the band's short-lived Plastex label was Plasticity in October '92. It continued the group's experimentation with techno sounds and further incorporated more down-tempo elements too. Despite the somewhat abrasive dialogue samples, Low Cool is a wonderfully atmospheric opener that combines moody synth experimentation with down-tempo beats. Meanwhile, the joyful Resonator splices jangling breakbeats with sprightly woodwind samples to create something considerably more upbeat than the Cabaret Voltaire name is maybe most associated with. Without Stephen Mallander's vocals, this era of the band is slightly more anonymous than their early work, but Plasticity is nevertheless an early example of experimental techno's relationship with less dance floor friendly textures, and the record alternates between straight-up bangers and down-tempo oddities. Had Cabaret Voltaire been a new act, they could easily have appeared on the first Artificial Intelligence on the strength of this record alone. The Designers Republic art, with its horizontal strip featuring the track list and credits spread across, looks a couple of years ahead of its time. If Maurice Gold's second Irresistible Vorse release, the Underground EP, leant much further into acid and techno than Space is the Place, then it was an outlier rather than a look to the future. Because in November 1992 came Flying High, the debut album, and it was pure ambient. With 5 of the 6 tracks, yes, this is another of those albums with long songs on it, featuring the word high in the title, it's unsurprising that Flying High is quite a trippy, druggy sounding record. Gold's staccato ambulance leads the way here, with arpeggios and gated samples used throughout, giving the pieces a strangely intense high-tempo sound whilst retaining the laid-back vibe. It's not a sound I've really heard from anyone else, and it's a fine example of how many of these early 90s ambient artists were using limited gear to try and create something beyond their means, arriving at an entirely new sound in the process. Maurice's love of Berlin School Cosmiche fed into his Irresistible Force sound, but the end result is dramatically different. Sampling everyone from Aphex Twin to Spaceman 3, as well as featuring plenty of 303 squelches, Flying High is a surprisingly dense melange of melodic fragments that effectively invents ambient trance, while trance was still barely a burgeoning style in its own right. There's more than a touch of the orb to the various sound effects and spoken word snippets utilised throughout, and there are some tonal similarities with the KLF's Chill Out too. It's arguably the third in a trilogy of the early collage-based classics, along with that and Adventures Beyond the Ultraworld, and the same English pastoral whimsy is present in places. If the album has a fault, it's that the tracks are less distinct and varied than they could be. With Gold incorporating the gated staccato sounds on every track, there are no major diversions that add the much needed variety that makes the best albums of the era stand out. It's not completely samey. High Frequency's 4 to the Floor beats and Symphony in E's breaks stand out from the otherwise beatless album, while Mountain High's gentle chord stabs are hugely memorable in themselves, but there's a kind of homogeneous feel to the proceedings that causes it to drop maybe a point or two for me. But it's still an excellent album, and one that offers images of summer evenings and blue skies stretching into infinity, and it's generally regarded as a classic of the era. Along with Biosphere's Microgravity, Flying High was one of the first records to find itself shared out among the various independents in the early 90s ambient market. In '93, the album was licensed out to the newly launched Apollo in Belgium and to Instinct in New York. Both of these labels would play significant roles in the growth of ambient in the 90s, and as with many such albums, they benefited from being able to distribute well-loved, tried and tested records while they were developing their own rosters. The original UK release is susceptible to disc rot on the CD versions. Rising High were sadly one of the many excellent labels who used the PDO plant responsible for these degraded discs, and both licensed versions feature generally worse artwork. The Apollo cover in general has an unpleasant garishness, despite not being so drastically different to the original. I think it's the curved text, which is unsurprising given parent label R&S's terrible art of their licensed version of FSOL's Accelerator earlier that year. The Belgian label would in '93 start to work with the Designers Republic almost exclusively, and there was much rejoicing. All 3 editions feature minimal art on the whole. My first experience of CD albums came via releases which seemed to really favour extensive artwork packages. FSOL's lush photo booklets, the conceptually striking Faro design for the Manic Street Preachers late 90s releases, the idiosyncratic fold-out spreads of Underworld's Tomato Collective, and going back to independent releases like these, very often made by small labels on a shoestring, I always find myself slightly disappointed by the presentation. Music is of course the most important aspect, but it's such a shame that so many wonderful albums from this era weren't afforded the budget some major label groups were given. With such visual music, albums like these are just crying out for lengthy photo booklets, deluxe gatefold sleeves and cutting-edge computer graphics. Especially since Flying High actually received a VHS release. 50 minutes of abstract CG, it's largely the same kind of thing as most electronic music videos at the time, and was certainly designed to be viewed in a less than sober state. Some of the graphics are surprisingly sophisticated for the time. Personally, I think they're better than the Orbs videos from the same year, even if the overall construction and presentation feels less well developed, and Morris makes a couple of brief appearances himself. While this was the most significant release on Rising High in 1992, a couple of other releases demonstrated the label's continued flirtation with ambient. Rising High Collective, label owner Casper Pound's collaborative project, released No Deeper Love, a slightly mellower track than normal, with a couple of notable remixes. The Excursion into Darkness version is an alternative take with quiet dubby beats that breaks down into synth pads and spoken word samples in the middle in an almost orb-aping moment. The remix 12-inch includes 2 Irresistible Force remixes, the mellow house of the solid state Logic mix, and an ambient mix which features less overt rhythms and filters a huge chunk of the track through Morris's gate effect. It could easily have come from Flying High. Meanwhile, the first of the label's techno injection compilations, while largely consisting of high-tempo breakbeat hardcore for the most part, does feature a remix of No Deeper Love, as well as Dub Collective's atmospheric minimal techno track House, and closes on the Irresistible Force's Space is the Place. Nothing was stopping the record from being back-to-front rave fodder, but the placement of these tracks is a sign that ambient was coming into favour on all fronts. Meanwhile in Frankfurt, future Rising High outfit Liquide released a couple of EPs, Neue Frankfurter Eletronik-Schule and Clash of Cultures. Liquide have always been exceptionally difficult to place, although ostensibly related to the ambient scene of the time, with plenty of beautiful melodic and atmospheric tracks. A significant proportion of their output is full-on, in-your-face acid, in some ways comparable with Aphex of this era in that way, although not quite as forward-thinking. These 2 early EPs were reissued together on Bandcamp in recent years, and their combined length plays out much like an album in its own right. Among the tracks are the mellow techno of Tanz der Lemminges Fire, the dubby acid track Das Quellgebiet des Amazonas, the utterly sinister Sun Progress, and the atmospheric acid of Coffeen, as well as faster-paced acid tracks. And that's it for today's episode of The Rise and Fall of the Chill Out Room. Please let me know what you think of the few releases I've discussed today and the early days of IDM and their crossover with Ambient Techno. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and there are like, subscribe and share buttons you also might want to press. Next time I'll be tying up 1992 with a look at the launch of Pete Namluke's Fax label and several oddities, one-offs and crossovers with other areas of music. I'll see you then.